So where did these come from? UFC 14 was the first time the UFC officially made fighters wear gloves, but it wasn't the first time they had been seen inside the octagon. Surprising to many, it's not Tank Abbott who was the first to wear them in the UFC. In modern MMA, fights typically require fighters to wear these 4-ounce gloves when they compete. And contrary to popular belief, they don't actually protect your face. They protect fighters' hands because if you don't wear gloves when you're fighting in MMA and you hit someone, especially on their head, you're very likely to break your hand. This is why fighters complain about broken wrists and broken hands all the time, and there's a history of fighters that have to retire because of their broken hands, even with the gloves. I'm doing a video on why MMA fighters shouldn't wear gloves coming out soon, so if you're interested in this, like and subscribe. The first time a fighter actually got in the octagon and wore gloves was UFC 4. It was former professional boxer Melton Bowen. He was the first allowed to walk into the cage wearing his gloves. But he wasn't the first to try. The first fighter to try to wear MMA-like gloves was Felix Mitchell at UFC 3. But controversially, Big John McCarthy, the referee at the time, asked the fighter to leave the gloves outside the cage. And henceforth he went and fought without his gloves.
American flag on his yellow trunks, preparing to take Felix Lee Mitchell, who I think is electing to take off his gloves. He's electing to take off his gloves to take on Ken Shamrock.
And it was totally optional for fighters to wear any kinds of gloves until UFC 14. Even though Big John McCarthy didn't let him at UFC 3. Very bizarre, one of the things we can't really explain. The reason a lot of people attribute Tank Abbott to being the person who popularized wearing MMA gloves in the UFC, even though most of his career came after them being legalized, it's because he was an extremely popular fighter in the early UFCs. He was a brawler that just swang and banged. People loved it. He didn't look like a fit guy. He was just big, tough, and scary. His use of the glove really came in tandem with him. This swept under the rug a lot of the history behind gloves in the UFC. Side note, who remembers Art Jimerson, the former pro boxer, wearing one boxing glove on one hand and then having his hand open on the other because he was afraid he wouldn't be able to tap if he got taken down? He did get taken down and submitted. Back on Tank Abbott, the reason Tank Abbott wore gloves in the early UFCs has a lot to do with why fighters wear them today. Instead of trying to protect your face, Tank Abbott wore them to protect his hands because he knew that he was going to throw lots of punches at fighters. That was his whole strategy. He was a swing and banging brawler, right? Abbott modified bag gloves to somewhat resemble what would become MMA gloves later. This allowed him, as modern MMA fighters do today, to protect their hands and to still wrestle and grapple somewhat. MMA gloves became mandatory in 1997 at UFC 14. This was kind of like the safety UFC where a lot of regulation came in. Gloves had to be regulated and approved by the UFC among other safety equipment. This is where we got mouth guards for one, and two, we got groin protection, cups, etc. Before that, fighters weren't required or had to wear these at all, and in some cases straight up did not. To standardize regulation, the UFC required that MMA gloves, starting at UFC 14, would have to be between 4 and 6 ounces, like this one. This signaled a move away from the human cockfighting and more into like professional sport-ish. The adoption of gloves in MMA as they are now was a critical turning point in how the sport is both perceived and how it is practiced. Because as I said earlier, when you wear gloves, it allows grappling, but it also limits it a lot. It makes chokes significantly more difficult, for example. In terms of safety, right, it doesn't really protect your face or where they're striking. It might avoid cuts to a degree, but it doesn't really do anything else. If you don't wear gloves and you throw closed fist punches, you are very likely to break your hand. This is why we saw MMA organizations like Pancrase without gloves, among others. There are still arguments today, as I will make in the next video, about why MMA should probably ditch the glove. Gloves are constantly evolving. For many years, MMA gloves in the UFC, for example, pointed the fingers straight, and we had a significantly higher rate of eye pokes in MMA, specifically in the UFC. Other organizations, like Pride, Bellator, etc., actually curved the fingers down a bit. This avoided a lot of the eye pokes. It's not perfect, but recently the UFC has been trying out new gloves, and they seem to be helping a bit. While generally speaking, the UFC popularized the use of gloves like this. They are not the origin of it. We have tons of theories, and none of them are really concrete. Japan's MMA organization Shooto, which still operates today, goes back as far as 1989 as enforcing the use of MMA-like gloves. The most likely theory is it's a carryover from traditional martial arts like karate, kempo, taekwondo. If you're familiar with competitive versions of all of these martial arts, they tend to have gloves that somewhat resemble MMA gloves, and they have had them for decades. In early MMA, traditional martial artists had a lot of representation. During the early years of MMA, traditional martial artists probably brought these over and influenced early MMA fighters with said gloves. The other large ongoing theory is that Bruce Lee heavily influenced early MMA as he influenced pop culture. In his movie Enter the Dragon, Bruce Lee is seen sporting Kempo-style combat gloves that resemble MMA gloves. As said in the traditional martial arts, this is a bit of a crossover, but he himself was extremely popular, a movie star sensation across the world. And on top of that, a martial artist sensation. To this day, people still debate on whether Bruce Lee could beat Conor McGregor. He could not, but yeah, cool. His influence was profound, so there is a shot that that also influenced early MMA gloves. Shooto, the Japanese MMA organization, and early Japanese MMA probably largely influenced a lot of MMA as we see it today, because that was the home for a lot of early MMA and early MMA experimentation. That's why we have Pride. That's why we have K1. That's why we have tons and tons and tons of early MMA organizations that go into a crossover with pro wrestling, boxing, kickboxing. It gets wild. So, what do you think the actual origin of these things are? What are those?